Hey Monster Hunters, if you're enjoying Beast and Bible, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and don't forget to share it with somebody who might like it. Now, on to the show.
Being a child in today's world is more difficult than ever before. And though we try to raise our children in a good Christian home, it's not always as easy as we might have hoped.
Well, here's a rainbow bright cereal box. On the box, there's a little five-sided star, and it's upside down, and it's another New Age and occultic symbol.
And of course, the Force is a word used by witches down through the centuries to describe the power they receive from Satan. Characters like Darth Vader, who look almost exactly like the ancient Norse god Odin, and Yoda was called the Zen Master. He's a three-toed beast, so he has the two fingers and the thumb, which from my information means Satan is Lord.
This important new video documentary with Peter Lalonde is must-viewing, and as always, you know that it is information that you can trust.
What you are hearing are sound bites from real media presentations by Christians in the 1980s. On TikTok, there's an account called Satanic Panic at the Disco that curates all these clips for those wanting to remember, be horrified by, or simply marvel at the experience that became known as the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic was a moral panic that began to build in the 1960s and 70s, when traditional views on sex were being questioned, traditional family structures were changing, and more children were being left at home as quote-unquote latchkey kids, raising concerns about how much time they spent being raised by television. Additionally, in the early 1970s, there was disillusionment in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate. In 1967, Anton LaVey published the Satanic Bible and founded the Church of Satan. He was featured prominently on the cover of Time magazine in 1972. People began to look toward alternative religions and experiments to find the truth. Alternative religious expressions included the Jesus People movement, neo-paganism, and what some called suburban witchcraft. Another fascinating element of the 1970s is the establishment of child abuse laws. Prior to 1974, government had played a minor role in child protection, but thanks to efforts by people such as Walter Mondale, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed in 1974. In 1980, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act followed. These political moves were a response to concerns about the safety of children and helped raise the awareness of the dangers facing youth. Finally, horror media themes in the 1970s included occult themes and dangers to children, as in the movie The Exorcist, where a young girl is possessed, and the movie Halloween, where a young boy murders his sister on Halloween and becomes the horror icon Michael Myers. So, to recap, society is having all its major institutions and traditional roles questioned. There is a rise in occult interest in both news and entertainment media, and the safety of children is of paramount concern in both politics and horror media. This heady cauldron of concern is at a rolling boil in the back of Christian minds as the 70s give way to the 80s, and then things get wild, and not just because of the hairspray, spandex, glam rock, and synth pop. In 1980, the cultural anxieties and fears of the 1970s came to a head with the publication of a sordid memoir entitled Michelle Remembers. This account of recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse, secret satanic societies, and a shadowy event called the Feast of the Beast that allegedly occurred every 27 years, where Satan initiates new priests, in this case it would be 1982, got people all riled up about the dangers of Satanism. Much like the Millerites were excited about Jesus' return in 1844, Christians and Americans in general got excited about the advent of an occult age that threatened abuse and enslavement of our children. Michelle Remembers and a cottage industry of escaped Satanist media lit the fuse of the cultural tinderbox, and the Satanic Panic erupted. No one was safe from the complex web of speculation by talk show hosts and Christian personalities that condemned everything from breakfast cereals, Saturday morning cartoons, toys, books, music, stuffed animals, and of course, Dungeons and Dragons, perhaps at the top of the most nefarious plots that we knew of, or thought we knew of. This is a fascinating era to explore, and to help me unpack it, I've invited Dr. Joseph Laycock, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Texas State University, to join me on the podcast. He is the author of Dangerous Games, What the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games Says About Play, Religion, and Imagined Worlds, published by University of California Press. It's a fascinating read, and I highly recommend it. Initially, I thought about calling this episode Dungeons and Dragons, due to the level of misinformation spread due to those caught up in the panic. However, as you'll see, the subject becomes more serious when we take into account the mental health struggles, the abuse of power by media outlets, and the downright dishonesty of Christian leaders spreading lies to build their platforms while damaging others emotionally, spiritually, and even physically. I also need to give a content warning, as we will be discussing suicide and mental health. We do our best to talk about it sensitively in the context of historical events, but it can still be a difficult subject for many to hear about. I also want to note that if you are having feelings of worthlessness or suicide, there is help and hope. Please dial the Suicide and Crisis Prevention Hotline at 988. I'm entitling this episode, Panic Attack, How the Satanic Panic of the 1980s Made Us Monstrous. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Dr. Laycock, thank you so much for being with us on Beast and Bible today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's get right to it. Just briefly, or as briefly as possible, what was the Satanic Panic, and is it still around today?
So the Satanic Panic was a conspiracy theory that held that there was a secret network of highly organized criminal Satanists who were killing people all over America in human sacrifices and torturing children in sadistic rituals, and that they had infiltrated police and law enforcement and the media to the point where there was never any evidence that any of this activity was actually occurring, right?
Right.
So this was based entirely on people claiming that they had been members of this cult and had since found Jesus and were sort of blowing the whistle on it. And then after 1980, recovered memory therapy. So people who were being hypnotized and in many cases remembering things from horror movies or suggestions left by their therapist, but recovering these memories of being abused by Satanists. And the idea was this abuse is so traumatic that it's erased. You can't consciously remember it unless a specially trained therapist retrieves it. And this has since been debunked by advances in how memory works in psychology by psychologists like Elizabeth Loftus. The Satanic Panic is remembered as a phenomenon of the 1980s, and certainly it got more play on talk shows and things like Geraldo in the 1980s. And I think these claims were taken much more seriously by law enforcement. The FBI did a pretty extensive probe into these allegations. But the public generally still believes these things are true, and I think that QAnon is a direct continuation of the Satanic Panic. I think the only thing that's really changed is these claims have now been weaponized for political purposes in a way that they were not in the 1980s. And right now, actually, Putin's propaganda ministry has begun saying that the invasion of the Ukraine is because the Ukrainians are Satanists.
Yes.
And that this is why Russians have to continue to support the war effort, because they are battling satanic forces in the Ukraine.
Yeah, so even though this is, and it's obviously not the first moral panic that's ever happened, but it's amazing that, 40 years, 30 years later, the elements are still there. There's just new variations on it. And I remember teaching my Monstrous Faith and Pop Culture class at last semester, and mentioning a couple things, whether it was the razor blades and the apples at Halloween, or any some of the backmasking and different things, or not back. What is it? What's what I'm looking for? Is that right? Backmasking.
Yeah, backmasking. Yeah,
like a few different things, and it was amazing how kids, Gen Z, didn't grow up in that era and weren't even familiar with some of the players, the bands, the names. They still heard some variation on those rumors that are still around that, like you had mentioned, have been long since debunked. And so no matter how much scholarship that's been thrown at it, there's these sort of urban legends that still are still percolating, still operating underneath the surface. So pivoting just a little bit now, what is Dungeons and Dragons and how did that develop?
Sure. So Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy role-playing game. A role-playing game at the most basic level is behavior children do naturally. If children play house, they are role-playing being their parents. If they play cops and robbers, they are role-playing being cops and robbers. When adults talk about a fantasy role-playing game, it's basically the same thing. The difference is there is some sort of mechanic to determine what's actually happening in the game. So a kid might point his index finger and say, "I shot you," and his friend might say, "No, you missed." In Dungeons & Dragons, you would have a 20-sided die, and there would be rules that clearly determined whether someone hit or missed. The origin of this is actually from military simulations. So the Prussian military was probably the first military to begin making simulations of battlefield war games, and they would do this training for officers. And then the American military adopted this in the late 1800s, and it somehow transferred into kind of the civilian market where you're recreating battles for recreational purposes, not for military training. And then it sort of evolved from, can we do medieval battles? Can we do medieval battles with a dragon in them? Can we get rid of the units and just focus on really powerful heroes, someone like, wizards and great warriors who could change the tide of battle single-handedly? And finally, it just evolved into everybody has one character, and there's not even a battle anymore. It's just sort of you do what you want. And so Dungeons & Dragons was published in 1974, and that was sort of the beginning of the game as we know it today.
And if I remember correctly, too, J.R.R. Tolkien in his writings, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, had some influence on some of the fantasy elements in Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, the 1960s saw a real turn towards fantasy, especially Tolkien, and that continued into the 1970s. And of course, it's the War of the Ring, right? The Tolkien is completely a military campaign being described. And so initially they said, well, let's have units of orcs and hobbits, and let's have wizards like Gandalf. And then Tolkien's estate sued Dungeons & Dragons very early on. So there are no hobbits in Dungeons & Dragons. There are halflings. There are no ents. There are trents. There are no balrogs. There are baelors. They could at least have dragons. Tolkien did not invent that. But yes, it's highly derivative of Tolkien. And the morality of Dungeons & Dragons is highly derivative of Tolkien's Catholicism. Good and evil in the original version of the game are not subjective at all, right? They are completely objective parts of the universe.
I remember having a colleague of mine who was a big Tolkien fan and a very dedicated practicing Christian. So one of the reasons that he was drawn to Lord of the Rings, especially the films, he's like, the good and evil are very distinct. Like, it's very clear, what's good, what's evil. There's no kind of gray area. It's just very clear. And that was nice in a world that sometimes gets a little bit complicated. So kind of on those lines too, and this can be debated probably among people of faith, but the creators of Dungeons & Dragons also had a faith background, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so Gary Gygax was a devout Christian, and at least we found some evidence that he was a Jehovah's Witness, at least for a while. Somebody found a letter he had sent in return to a Christmas card that said, well, thank you for wishing me Merry Christmas, but I don't celebrate Christmas because it's not in the Bible. and Jehovah's Witnesses don't practice it. David Arneson was the other inventor of Dungeons & Dragons, and he also was an evangelical and had done some missionary work. So the sort of Christian aspects of these two men's personality did come out in the game, maybe not in a direct way, but the evidence is clearly there. Their faith kind of shaped the ideas they had for this game.
Okay, just for our listeners who are unfamiliar and this is all new for them, if you had to pick out one or two examples of where their faith would have influenced the contours of the game, what could they look at?
Sure. So one of the earliest character classes that they made was the cleric class. So sword and sorcery is a genre. So you need people who are good with weapons. You need people who can cast magical spells. There's really no need to have a faith-based character, and yet it was important to them that such a character exists. And then if you look at the types of spells that a cleric can cast through their faith, it's all biblical references, right? So sticks to snakes, right, is a reference to Exodus. There is a spell which summons two bears to come fight for you. This is a very obscure passage where the prophet Elisha is mocked, and God sends two she-bears to punish children for mocking him. Flame strike is an ability used by the prophet Elijah. Parting water, the list goes on. And a lot of these spells are sort of weird. It only makes sense that they're in the game at all, unless you knew that Gary Gygax sort of had a Bible out, and that was one of his inspirations.
Super interesting. So now, before we link these two together, one more question. There have been studies showing how D&D has led to pro-social behavior. What are some of the benefits that people have found through their research as far as those who engage in this type of tabletop game?
Yeah, I think that I've found lots of reports of people saying that they discovered parts of themselves that they didn't fully understand through playing the game. And a lot of that is things like I can be a leader, right? I can organize my friends, and we can have a challenging situation, and I can use our resources, and we can find a way to solve the problem. Or I can be braver than I thought, or I could be tougher than I thought. I've even found reports of people who say, well, if they go on like a blind date or something and they're nervous, they kind of think about how would my character handle this situation.
Yeah.
I also found one article in a psychotherapy journal from a therapist who had someone who was institutionalized after a suicide attempt, a young man who had attempted suicide. And he played Dungeons and Dragons with him, and the young man wanted to be a chaotic evil character, which was one of the controversies around the game, that you could choose to be evil. And, would do evil things in the game. And then later the therapist would say, so why do you think your character want to do these things? And very quickly it came down to, I'm mad at my dad, right? And it was sort of this breakthrough in therapy, but this young man was kind of only able to talk about that because he had been given freedom to kind of explore his own sort of darker impulses.
So it's used in therapy to treat a variety. I've read a few different things too. I've read it not as dramatic as that, but they've talked about treating depression. They've looked at, like you mentioned, identity. Even with live action role play scenarios, I've talked to participants who said, I am able to explore, different person. It's always a part of me, but it might be a part of me that I'm scared to lean into. So an introvert might try being an extrovert for a while or something like that. And it's interesting to watch how that becomes a way for self-exploration and understanding, even if outside the game they don't adjust their sort of regular personality. That's interesting. Now, of course, the big question here, growing up in the church as a preacher's kid and listening to different conversations in the 80s and early 90s, Dungeons and Dragons was always taboo. It was always evil. It was always satanic. There was always the potential for summoning a real evil entity, a demon or something. And it was very off limits. And that has softened somewhat now. And I'm curious, how did Dungeons and Dragons get swept up in this satanic panic? How did these two things get linked together?
Right. So there were a number of things. I mean, first of all, a moral panic, especially one kind of postulating an evil conspiracy theory, one common connection across time in these evil conspiracy theories, they always want to corrupt the youth. They always want to make the youth like them. Evil is parasitical in that sense. So there's a real fear that the evil will present itself as things marketed to youth, like rock music, like cartoons. There was real fear also about things like the Smurfs at this time period. And of course, Dungeons and Dragons, right? So there's already that kind of suspicion on this. There was a panic over cults in America going on in the 1970s, and the sort of referee who runs the game is called a dungeon master, and that, I think, resonated with ideas of a cult leader. And then there were two kind of high-profile cases involving suicides of young men, where people blamed Dungeons and Dragons and said this game was inducing a form of insanity. And so that was really kind of the beginning of this. And then the other factor is Dungeons and Dragons books, especially in the 70s, were very hard to just pick up and read. If you just picked it up as a parent, you really couldn't make heads or tails of it. It was all these strange tables and figures and numbers, but there were pictures, and the pictures were really graphic and would show usually heroes fighting demons, but sometimes things like altars with people chained to them. And so if you had just heard somewhere that this was this really demonic, evil game, and all you had to go on was those pictures, I can see why people might just assume this was all true and assume the worst.
Right. So it's like picking up an esoteric text with rules that make no sense. And you've got these very striking visuals, and it's an easy leap to make, where obviously they're teaching the occult. They're doing a number of, whatever secret practices that are harming children. Yeah, it's easy to see how that link would happen. So now there's a key character in all of this. I mean, there's several, but one that shows up in this mix of Satanic Panic and Dungeons & Dragons is Patricia Pulling. So she creates an organization called BAD, 2Ds, Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. And her work and organization is launched after her son's death by suicide. Can you share a bit on the narrative she created and what happened as a result?
The narrative that Patricia Pulling formed around this was that his suicide was a direct result of playing Dungeons & Dragons as part of his honors English curriculum in high school. And I looked into it. I actually tracked down someone who knew Irving Pulling.
Without going into too many details, they revealed that Irving's family life was relationally unstable, and Irving had shown signs of mental health issues before his death and before he played Dungeons & Dragons.
And he had only actually played Dungeons & Dragons for about 5 hours in his entire life. And another kind of example that something very bad was going on with his family is actually found Bink's old character sheet. And the old character sheet has a place to draw your character's insignia, and there's a swastika there. And the Pulling family is Jewish. So this is also a sign of course, not a normal Dungeons & Dragons player. And so the plot in the game involves someone being cursed with lycanthropy, right? A curse that makes you become a werewolf on the full moon. And Patricia Pulling had sort of formed this idea that it wasn't just that Bink's character had a curse and the quest was to undo the curse, but that the game had actually programmed him to murder his family. So it was a curse in real life, not in the game. Similar to the movie The Manchurian Candidate, right? Where someone is brainwashed to be a kind of mind-controlled assassin. And so what she said was, this game had given basically a hypnotic suggestion to my son to murder his whole family.
We went into the kitchen, and there on the table were what we thought were just regular composition books with schoolwork in it, and much of the Dungeons & Dragons material, along with this curse he had received in the game that day that he died.
Dr. Laycock noted that, according to Pulling, the only way for her son to escape the effects of this alleged curse was by suicide.
So in fact, this wasn't a suicide at all. Her son had effectively martyred himself to save the family from the evil of this game. And I think that's pretty silly, but I could certainly understand why a parent would prefer to believe that.
Right. So you have a situation where there's clearly a lot of instability at home, and who knows what other dysfunctions, maybe even abuse, and this horrible thing happens where her son dies by suicide, and you're looking around for someone, and we do this is a natural impulse, I think, when we encounter tragedy or things. We want an explanation, we want a narrative, we want a cause and effect, and it's far easier to maybe blame this game than to really turn around, look in the mirror, and say maybe there was a lot more going on here in this young man's life than 5 hours playing a board game.
Absolutely. I think it's a form of intellectual laziness, right, of finding quick solutions to complicated problems. And this kept happening throughout the panic, where young men would do some kind of inexplicable crime, and people would say, how could anybody do this? What went wrong? And the sort of ready-made solution was always, if they ever played D&D at any point in their life, that must be the reason that this has happened.
Yeah. And it sounds, having distance from it and being in 2022 and not in 1985 or 89, it seems, like you said, silly or unbelievable, and yet it still got traction. It took off. It found some way to embed itself in the cultural imagination, to move right along with the panic, and she really took this on the road.
Yeah, so Patricia Pulling actually, she made a career as an expert witness, and she would work either if you were sort of trying to ban D&D. So one of her goals was D&D should have to have a warning label, kind of like a pack of cigarettes, that just says this game causes suicide and insanity and all these other things. But also, if you were convicted of a crime, you could call Patricia Pulling, and she would testify on your behalf that you weren't responsible for what you did because you played Dungeons & Dragons. And this was called the D&D defense. It never worked. I never found a case where anyone was exonerated. But Patricia Pulling would come in and testify that, including things like someone robbed a gas station, and said, well, I don't know. I thought the gas station attendant was an orc or something, right? It's just ridiculous. But you get, whether you win or lose, expert witnesses get a big payday, simply for going to court and arguing that. And she began to appear on talk shows, and then she began to declare herself an expert on all manner of so-called satanic crime, and positioned herself more largely in the Satanic Panic. She wrote a book called The Devil's Web. And in 1989, a student from the University of Texas was murdered in Matamoros, Mexico, by a drug cartel as part of a ritual a member of this drug cartel wanted to do. And for the Satanic Panic, they said, this is the smoking gun that proves everything we've always said is true. And Patricia Pulling basically drove to Mexico and took a selfie at this crime scene. And that was sort of part of her kind of authority of, I must know what I'm talking about because I went on this gruesome sort of tourist trip.
Like a stand-up tourism kind of a situation.
Yeah, and she also was involved in police. So you could also make money during a Satanic Panic leading occult crime seminars, which she did, and made money doing that. And that also becomes a kind of paradox about where your authority comes from, right? Because the police are saying, well, she's an occult crime expert, so, she must know what she's talking about. And she can say, well, all these police hired me, right? So I must know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just creates this, no one's really looking at credentials. And I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but what were her credentials? What was her actual background?
So she had a 2-year associate's degree. I don't know in what subject, but basically was not really an educated person, and especially when it came to things like statistics. So she kept a list of suicides and other crimes associated with Dungeons and Dragons. And a mathematician said, let's just assume everybody on this list committed suicide because they played Dungeons and Dragons. That's actually still lower than the national suicide rates, right, of how many people played this game. She also put things on the list, like there was a Tom Hanks movie called Mazes and Monsters, which is set at Grant College. Grant College is not a real place. Patricia Pulling's list, though, included Grant College as a place where Dungeons and Dragons inspired crimes occurred. The other thing is she lived in Richmond, Virginia, and she told the paper that 8% of the population of Richmond, Virginia were Satanists. And a journalist called her out on it and said, that means there's more Satanists than Methodists in Richmond, Virginia. How are you getting these figures? And she said, well, 4% of the adults are Satanists and 4% of the kids are Satanists. And if you add that up, that's 8%. So real kind of, not real literacy in sort of basic math, but also kind of how to do research. So, but her authority did not come from any of those things. Her authority came from her story of, I am this bereaved mother and my son was taken from me.
Yeah, and then because that fits sort of the zeitgeist and the cultural fear at the time, people were maybe a lot less discerning and critical of that firsthand testimony and took it and ran with it. And as you mentioned, law enforcement gets involved, and this is one of the more interesting things as I read your book and read other accounts of this. Can you share a story or two about how, you've kind of shared how they became involved as far as law enforcement goes, but are there any specific cases of people in authority fabricating stories similar to maybe, and I always want to be careful here because I know Patricia Pulling was a grieving mother, and so I know it's complicated, but there are other cases of people in authority, law enforcement, detectives, who capitalized on this and kind of built their own platforms. Can you share maybe one or two stories about that?
Yeah, again, in the 80s, a lot of taxpayer money was being given to really disingenuous people, right, claiming that they could teach about satanic crime. And some of these people would set up fake altars with black candles and skulls and things. One of them showed police the movie Rosemary's Baby and said satanic cults are just like in this horror movie. There's a great book by Robert Hicks, who was a police officer, called In Pursuit of Satan, where he's basically a whistleblower about these seminars. But BAD produced and for police for interrogating people who played Dungeons and Dragons. And eventually a group formed called the Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Games, which arose in opposition to BAD, right? To basically try to say BAD is full of it, and we want to Right, bad is bad, and we want to expose what they're doing. And so they knew these documents existed, and they went to the police department and they said, "Hi, we're here to see documents from Patricia Pulling." And they basically said, we don't know what you're talking about. We have no such documents. Go away. And eventually, a member of the Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Game was in law enforcement, and just made a copy and said, "No, they were lying to you, right? They had these documents. They knew exactly what you're talking about. They told Patricia Pulling somebody came around asking for the documents." So we now are able to see those sort of questionnaires, and they have questions like, "Have you ever read the Necronomicon?" for example. Yeah, most people who play Dungeons & Dragons are savvy enough to know the Necronomicon is an imaginary book. It's like Harry Potter's spell book or something. It isn't real. But Patricia Pulling didn't know that, and she thought it was real. It says things like, figure out who is the dungeon master. And they'll lie and say they take turns playing the dungeon master, but that's not true. Figure out which one it is. It's almost sort of like an I am Spartacus kind of thing, right? It's where they're trying to cover for each other. And I think that also speaks to the dungeon master being misunderstood through this lens of the cult leader, right? That whoever is the dungeon master basically can mind control the other members of this group, both inside and outside of the game. I don't know that these documents were ever actually used, but I cannot imagine being a teenager in the 80s and being interrogated by the police and being asked these completely insane questions.
Fear is healthy when it helps us avoid danger, but when fear is built on lies that lead to anxiety and panic, followers of Christ adopt methods and attitudes that resemble the devil. Often, we want these types of sensational evil reports to be true, not because we wish people ill, but because it becomes a type of dark confirmation that our worldview of good and evil, God versus Satan, is true. When we don't see the divine interventions or miracles in our lives that the disciples in the New Testament had, we may be tempted to look towards the forces of darkness for validation. Christians also have urban legends, mythologies, and even horror stories we create around our fears and anxieties to prop up our worldviews. And over time, these false tales feel so true that when someone begins to question them or point out that the details don't add up, we feel attacked. No doubt there are listeners here who will walk away thinking that this episode is about compromising our media standards and promoting the playing of Dungeons & Dragons, but that would be a fear response. The goal of the podcast, and especially these final episodes, is to demonstrate how we can become complicit in our cultural, theological anxiety loops and lean on narratives that are not true in order to share the truth. 1 John 4:18 tells us that perfect love casts out fear, and Philippians 4:6-7 tells us to share our anxieties with God, and the peace of God that passes all understanding will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. The Christian faith certainly includes vigilance and discernment, but our way of moving through life is characterized by love and peace, not panic. And if your faith causes you more panic than peace, then it may be an invitation to examine the truth of the claims you might be consuming in Christian media and return to the life of Christ as your example. I hope you enjoyed this episode and will join us for the conclusion of my interview with Dr. Laycock and the final episode of this season of Beast and Bible. Thank you for listening.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.